The sharp echo of a slap shattered the silence in the hallway. Ethan stumbled back, his cheek burning, his book spilling onto the cold tile floor. Laughter rippled through the crowded corridor, a cruel, cutting sound that twisted his stomach. The bullies stood over him, sneering. "Stay in your lane, freak," one of them spat. Ethan's fingers trembled as he reached for his notebook, but a heavy boot pinned it to the ground. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He forced himself to meet their eyes, but all he saw was contempt. The crowd didn't help. They watched, some whispering, some smirking, but none stepping in. Then, a voice. Steady. Commanding. Unexpected. Enough. The hallway went still. Mr. Carter, the literature teacher, stood at the edge of the scene, his sharp gaze locked on the bullies. His posture was calm, but his eyes burned with something fierce. "Pick up his books," he said, his voice quiet yet firm. No one moved. "I said, pick them up." The bullies hesitated, glancing at each other. For the first time, they looked uncertain. Ethan's pulse raced. Could this really be happening? For the first time in forever, someone stood up for him. And it was only the beginning. Ethan Parker had learned to walk the hallways like a ghost, silent, small, unnoticed. Or at least, that was the goal. But no matter how much he tried to disappear, some people made sure he never forgot what they thought of him. Ever since he came out last year, things had only gotten worse. The whispers. The shoves. The notes shoved into his locker with words that cut deeper than fists. Crescent High wasn't an awful place, not on the surface. It had the usual mix of students, the overachievers, the athletes, the ones who just wanted to survive until graduation. But for Ethan, every day felt like a battlefield. His classmates weren't all cruel, but even the kind ones stayed silent when things got bad. At home, things weren't much better. His mom worked double shifts at the diner, leaving little energy to notice the pain in her son's eyes. His dad. He was long gone, the last words he ever said to Ethan still haunting him. "This isn't how I raised you." The only place Ethan felt safe was in Mr. Carter's literature class. Mr. Carter was different from the other teachers. He didn't just teach, he listened. He saw people. His classroom was a refuge, a place where words had power and stories could change lives. And for Ethan, books were an escape. A world where heroes won, where people like him weren't just tolerated but celebrated. But even that sanctuary wasn't enough to stop the storm brewing outside. The bullying had reached a breaking point. The taunts had turned into shoves, and the shoves had turned into bruises. He told himself he could endure it. He had to. Until today. Until Mr. Carter stepped in. And suddenly, for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something he barely recognized. Hope. Ethan sat in Mr. Carter's classroom after school, his hands clenched around the edge of his desk. The words of the bullies still echoed in his head, but louder than that was the memory of what had just happened, Mr. Carter standing up for him. No teacher had ever done that before. No adult had ever really stepped in. Now, here he was, alone with the one person who had. Mr. Carter leaned against his desk, arms crossed, watching Ethan carefully. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked. Ethan shook his head, staring at his hands. "It doesn't matter," he muttered. Mr. Carter sighed. "It does, Ethan. I've seen what they do to you. Today was just the first time I caught them in the act." Ethan swallowed hard. He hated this. Hated feeling weak. "Nothing's going to change," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Carter was quiet for a moment, then pulled a book from his desk. A worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. He placed it in front of Ethan. "You know why this story matters?" Mr. Carter asked. Ethan frowned, but knew better than to ignore the question. "Because Atticus Finch stood up for what was right," he said quietly. "Even when the whole town was against him," Mr. Carter added. "Even when it was hard." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, well, I'm not Atticus. And I'm not some hero in a book." Mr. Carter crouched to Ethan's level, his expression serious. "You don't have to be. But you do have a choice. You can keep your head down and hope they stop, or you can stand up and make them stop." Ethan tensed. "I can't fight them." "I'm not saying you should," Mr. Carter said. "But you don't have to fight alone. If you let me, I'll help you." Ethan's chest tightened. No one had ever said that to him before. Not his mom, not his old friends, no one. He wanted to believe Mr. Carter, but doubt gnawed at him. What could a teacher do? The school didn't care. The bullies wouldn't stop just because someone told them to. Still, something about the way Mr. Carter looked at him made Ethan feel like, maybe, for once, he wasn't completely alone. "Think about it," Mr. Carter said, standing up. "You don't have to decide now. But when you're ready, I'll be here." Ethan looked at the book on the desk. His fingers traced the cover. For the first time in a long time, he felt a spark, small but real. A choice. And a chance to change everything. Ethan spent the rest of the evening staring at the book Mr. Carter had given him. His fingers traced the worn edges, the creases along the spine. He had read To Kill a Mockingbird before, but it felt different now. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because, for the first time, someone was asking him to be brave, not just to survive, but to fight back in his own way. The next morning at school, he kept his head down as usual, weaving through the hallways, hoping to avoid confrontation. But it didn't take long before Logan and his pack of friends found him near his locker. "Look who it is," Logan sneered, leaning against the metal door. "Still thinking about yesterday, Parker? You should be grateful. At least now you've got your boyfriend, Mr. Carter, looking out for you." The others laughed, and Ethan's stomach tightened. He could feel the eyes of passing students flicking toward him, watching but saying nothing. He hated how normal this was for them, how normal it had become for him. This time, though, he didn't just take it. Instead of looking at the floor and waiting for it to pass, he straightened his shoulders. His hands trembled, but he met Logan's eyes. "You done?" Ethan asked, his voice low but steady. Logan's grin faltered just a little. "What did you say?" "You heard me." There was a beat of silence, and then Logan's smirk returned. He shoved Ethan back against the locker, hard enough to rattle it. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood," he muttered. "See you around, Parker." They walked away, laughing, leaving Ethan frozen in place. His breath came fast, his pulse racing. He hadn't won, not really, but he also hadn't backed down. And for the first time, he felt the tiniest flicker of control. That afternoon, he stayed after class again. Mr. Carter didn't say much at first, just let Ethan sit at his desk, flipping through the book. When the silence stretched long enough, Ethan finally spoke. "I don't know how to make them stop." Mr. Carter leaned back against his desk. "Maybe that's not the right question." Ethan frowned. "Then what is? How do you want to live? Do you want to spend every day waiting for them to leave you alone, or do you want to take up space, be who you are, without letting them decide what that means?" Ethan looked down at his hands. "I don't know if I can do that." "You don't have to do it alone," Mr. Carter said. "There are people who will stand with you. You just have to let them." That night, Ethan thought about those words. He thought about the loneliness, the weight of it. Maybe he'd been so focused on the people who hated him that he never looked for the ones who might care. The next day, he sat with Zoe at lunch. They used to be close, before everything. Before he came out, before she got tired of pretending she didn't notice the way people treated him. He expected her to look surprised when he sat down, but she just raised an eyebrow. "Hey, stranger." Ethan hesitated. "Hey." A pause. Then, "You good?" He almost said yes. Almost shrugged it off like he always did. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the exhaustion or the fact that he was trying, really trying, to change something. "Not really," he admitted. Zoe didn't push. She just nodded. "Yeah, that tracks." They ate in silence for a while. It wasn't comfortable, exactly, but it wasn't awful either. It was something. The weeks that followed weren't easy. Logan and his friends didn't just stop because Ethan started sitting with Zoe again. They shoved him in the hallways, whispered slurs under their breath. But something had shifted. When Logan tripped him near the library, sending his books sprawling, Ethan bent down to pick them up, and Zoe was already there, handing him one before he could reach for it. When one of Logan's friends muttered something in class, Mr. Carter cut them off with a single sharp glance. And when Ethan had a panic attack in the bathroom, gripping the sink so hard his knuckles turned white, a quiet voice from the next stall said, "Breathe, man. You're not alone." It wasn't a grand victory. It wasn't like the movies, where the bullies saw the error of their ways and stopped overnight. But it was change. One afternoon, as Ethan walked to his locker, he found something taped to the door. His heart clenched, expecting another cruel message. But when he peeled it off, his breath caught in his throat. A piece of notebook paper, with 4 simple words written in neat handwriting. "You're not alone, Ethan." His vision blurred. He pressed the note to his chest for just a second before slipping it into his pocket. He didn't know who had written it. Maybe it was Zoe. Maybe it was someone else. But for the first time, it didn't matter. Because it was true. It happened after school, just outside the main entrance. Ethan had stayed late to finish an assignment in the library, hoping to avoid the usual crowd. But as he stepped into the cool evening air, his stomach dropped. Logan and his friends were waiting. "Hey, Parker," Logan called, pushing off the railing. His smirk was razor-sharp. "Been real quiet lately. Thought maybe you needed a reminder of your place." Ethan's pulse thundered. He glanced toward the parking lot, empty except for a few teachers' cars. No one was around. No one to stop this. He thought about running. He thought about lowering his head, pretending he didn't hear them. But something inside him snapped. Not fear. Not anger. Something bigger. He was tired of being afraid. Tired of feeling small. Tired of waiting for someone else to step in. So, instead of walking away, he stood his ground. "No," Ethan said, his voice firm. Logan blinked, as if he hadn't heard right. "What?" Ethan's hands trembled, but he clenched them into fists, not to fight, but to hold himself steady. "I said no. You don't get to decide who I am. You don't get to make me afraid." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Logan's face, but it was gone in an instant. He stepped forward, fists clenched. "You want to say that again?" Ethan's heart pounded, but he didn't move. He didn't flinch. "Hit me if you want," Ethan said, his voice shaking but strong. "It won't change anything. You think this makes you powerful? Hurting people doesn't make you strong, Logan. It makes you weak." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Logan's jaw tightened. His friends shifted behind him, suddenly unsure. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Ethan was supposed to cower. He was supposed to shrink. Instead, he stood tall. "And then, walk away, Logan." Mr. Carter's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He was standing at the top of the steps, arms crossed, his gaze steady. Logan let out a bitter laugh. "Wow. Guess you really do need your boyfriend to save you." Ethan turned his gaze back to him, his fear fading. "He's not saving me." His voice was calm, certain. "I saved myself." Logan stared at him, something unreadable in his eyes. Then, with a frustrated shake of his head, he turned and walked away. His friends hesitated, then followed. Ethan let out a shaky breath. His hands were still trembling, but for the first time, it wasn't out of fear. Mr. Carter walked down the steps and stopped beside him. "That was brave." Ethan swallowed hard, nodding. For the first time, he felt it. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was fighting. And he had won. The next day, something felt different. The hallways of Crescent High hadn't changed. Students still rushed to class, laughter and conversation filled the air, and the same groups sat in their usual spots. But for Ethan, the world didn't feel as small anymore. People noticed him. Not in the way they used to, not with whispers or smirks, but with something else. A few nods. A glance of acknowledgement. A quiet kind of respect. It wasn't just in his head. As he approached his locker, Zoe was already there, leaning against the metal doors. "So," she said, arms crossed, a smirk playing on her lips. "That was some real main character energy yesterday." Ethan let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "I don't know about that." "Please," she said, pushing off the locker. "You stared Logan in the face and told him he was weak." "I thought he was going to explode." Ethan shrugged. "I was scared." Zoe nudged his arm. "Yeah. You did it anyway." That was the difference, wasn't it? The fear hadn't disappeared. He still felt it, coiling in his stomach, whispering doubts in the back of his mind. But for the first time, it didn't control him. As he grabbed his books, Something else caught his eye. A folded piece of paper slipped through the vents of his locker. His chest tightened for a second, old instincts telling him it was another cruel note. But when he unfolded it, his breath caught. "You're braver than you know." No name. Just those 6 words. Zoe read over his shoulder. "Oh, a secret admirer." Ethan rolled his eyes, but a smile tugged at his lips. "Shut up." He wasn't sure who had left it. Maybe one of the other students who had been there yesterday. Maybe someone who had been watching in silence for a long time. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that someone saw him. And maybe, just maybe, his choice to stand up had given them courage, too. Later that afternoon, Mr. Carter found him in the library. Ethan sat at a corner table, his notebook open, but he wasn't writing. He was just thinking, processing. Mr. Carter slid into the seat across from him, setting a fresh cup of coffee on the table. "For your thoughts." Ethan smiled a little, taking the cup. "Thanks." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Mr. Carter spoke. "How are you feeling?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "Lighter," he admitted. Mr. Carter nodded. "Good." Then, after a pause, he asked, "What's next?" That question used to terrify Ethan. The future had always seemed like a dark tunnel, one he wasn't sure he could make it through. But now, "I don't know," he said honestly. "But for once, I think I'm excited to find out." Mr. Carter smiled, lifting his cup. "To new beginnings, then." Ethan clinked his coffee cup against his. "To new beginnings." And for the first time in a long time, he meant it. Years later, Ethan would look back on that day, the day he stood his ground, as the moment everything began to change. Not overnight. Not in some grand, cinematic way. But in small, steady steps. Logan and his friends didn't turn into saints, but they stopped targeting him. Maybe because they realized he wouldn't break. Maybe because they saw that others were watching now. Either way, the weight he had carried for so long slowly lifted. More students started speaking up. A quiet shift, barely noticeable at first, someone telling a bully to back off, another standing beside the kid who always sat alone. One voice had become 2, then 3. By his senior year, Ethan was no longer just surviving Crescent High. He was thriving. He had friends. He had confidence. He had hope. And when he walked across the stage at graduation, Mr. Carter was in the crowd, clapping the loudest. Years later, standing in front of his own classroom, Ethan placed a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird on his desk. His students chatted, unaware of the quiet, full-circle moment he was having. Then, as class began, he looked out at them, the misfits, the dreamers, the kids just trying to find their way. And he said the words that had once changed his life. "You don't have to do it alone."